Hello, I'm Harry Glorikian, and this is the Harry Glorikian Show, where we explore how technology is changing everything we know about healthcare. Today's guest, Brian Pepin, says there haven't really been any advances in the treatment of Parkinson's disease in a decade. The standard treatment is still the standard treatment, meaning various drugs to replace dopamine in the brain, since the loss of neurons that produce dopamine is one of the hallmarks of the disease. But there has been one important change during that decade. Thanks to new technology, ranging from wearables like the Apple Watch to sophisticated deep brain implants from companies like Medtronic, we're now able to gather a lot more data about what's happening in the daily lives of patients with Parkinson's, and how the disease is affecting their brain function and their physical movement. Which means now there's the potential to make much smarter and more timely decisions about how to dose the drugs patients are taking or whether they should think about joining a clinical trial. Gathering and analyzing that information and feeding it back to patients and their doctors in a form they can use is the mission of Pepin startup, Rune Labs. Pepin thinks we're on the edge of a new era of precision neurology, where data gives doctors the power to predict the course of a disease and muster a meaningful clinical response. And as you'll hear, he wants Rune Labs to be at the leading edge of that change. Here's our full conversation. Brian, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Harry.
So, I've read a bunch of stuff on the company. Sounds really exciting. But from everything I've read, it sounds like your mission at Rune Labs is to help patients and their doctors take a more data-driven approach to monitoring and treating neurological disorders, starting with Parkinson's.
Yeah.
So, can you start by reminding listeners what is Parkinson's disease, what causes it, how it's diagnosed, and how many people are affected by it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Parkinson's, like a lot of neurological diseases, the underlying mechanism, there's theories about kind of what there are, but there's nothing that's really consensus. This is what Parkinson's is. So Parkinson's, as we know it, is a collection of symptoms, a collection of patterns that we see in patients over time and at given points in time that we say, hey, this is Parkinson's, and we're gonna treat that with this set of interventions. And so it's a movement disorder. It manifests as a movement disorder, although it's driven by the degradation and the sort of dying off of neurons in the brain over time. It typically affects folks over the age of 55, but there's also a large fraction of folks with Parkinson's that are what's called early onset. So they're getting it maybe when they're 30. Michael J. Fox famously had early onset Parkinson's. And there's plus or minus 10%, around 1 million folks in the U.S. with some stage of Parkinson's disease. So it affects about 2/3 of 1% of 2/3 of 1% of folks. Yeah, 2/3 of 1%. It's also kind of interest. I think it's sort of often treated as a sort of model neurodegenerative disorder, in that it's sort of in many ways just looks like accelerated brain aging, right? And this is just it's the brain and some ways for whatever reason aging in an accelerated way. So that's the world in which we live in, and like as you kind of mentioned, we're trying to bring precision medicine to neurology, taking a Parkinson's first approach. The big reasons for that are Parkinson's. The data is sort of available today, so there's a lot of data being generated as part of routine care that we have access to and can make use. The clinicians are ready to actually use this data in the context of care, so that's super important. And then also important is there's a range of new therapies that are in the development pipeline, where the data that we're bringing to the table and this kind of precision medicine approach can accelerate the time of those therapies into the clinic And that's an important part of what we're doing too, is, I think we realized that what's available in Parkinson's today is mostly palliative care. It's not the end game for it. We want to help bring some of these things that are protective or even curative to market as quickly as possible. So
yeah, so you mentioned treatment. So can you explain to people maybe how treatments for Parkinson's has evolved over, let's say, the past decade, right? I mean,
yeah,
particularly, I think, neuromodulation technologies like deep brain stimulation.
Yeah, well, so unfortunately, and this is kind of a part of the reason why we exist, treatments haven't evolved really at all over the last decade. But if you go back into, the last, I think, major addition to the therapy pantheon was deep brain stimulation, as you mentioned. I'll explain that in a sec, but the sort of baseline therapy for Parkinson's is a dopamine replacement. So you have neurons in your brain, dopaminergic neurons that are dying off. You sort of compensate for that by adding dopamine into the brain in a variety of ways. And that helps. It doesn't help slow the progression of the disease, but it helps ameliorate the troublesome symptoms, the movement symptoms, and some of these things. Eventually, as the disease progresses, that isn't enough. And so you have to do these second line sort of therapies, one of which is called deep brain stimulation. So this is where you get a pacemaker-like device implanted into the area of your brain that is sort of going most haywire, right, in the disease. We actually, one of our flagship partnerships is with Medtronic, who provides one of these devices, and recently has started producing devices that are doing continuous sensing of the brain in addition to providing the stimulation. That's really cool because it gives us a whole bunch of extra data about how to optimize patients' therapies. I can talk about that later. But there's also other kind of surgical interventions. There's what's called focused ultrasound. So they go in and sort of get rid of a small, very like millimeter chunk of the brain, and that helps ameliorate symptoms. There's clinical trials that people can enroll in, things that we're involved in that are like stem cell replacement therapies. So you actually get new neurons, stem cell neurons injected into your brain to replace the dead neurons. And then there's, like I said, a range of stuff in the pipeline that's kind of experimental.
But in reality, like like in my research, I would bet that you'd make the case that deep brain stimulation and other forms of neuromodulation are more effective when they're informed by deeper, richer data about the patients. And I'm not sure if that thesis is correct or not.
Yeah, I would say that thesis has been borne out for a variety of reasons. So one, there's these therapies are not one size fits all. Like there's a lot of knobs that can be turned that really kind of customize it for each person, right? And if you're a busy clinician, how are you going to know how to turn these knobs, right? And so we provide a lot of data that kind of instructs how to turn these knobs in the right way, so that the patients can go home and really feel like they're getting the most out of this investment that they've made in their own treatment, right? They've gone and had brain surgery. They should feel really good as possible, right? So that's one. I think the other side of it is, who should be getting these therapies, right? And so relative to the clinical outcomes, most, even, whether it's Michael J. Fox or the clinician organizations, everybody sort of recognizes that something like deep brain stimulation is sort of underpenetrated. Like there's way more people that can benefit from it than are getting it, but it's not always clear, like who should you prescribe it to, right? And so that's another area where data can be really important, saying, hey, this is the phenotype of someone who is really going to benefit from this treatment. Therefore, you, the clinician, and you, the patient, should have some increased confidence to go get this therapy. Because we see that patients like you, 95+% of the time, get these great outcomes.
Yeah. I mean, most of the time, especially in all these neurological diseases, it's just trying to, who should be in the trial? Like, why should, finding that right person. Otherwise, I think that's why most of these trials fail, is because you're not even picking the right population most of the time.
That's a big reason. Yeah.
But let's back up here for a second. Like love to understand more of the whole story of the company. I mean, you founded Rune Labs back in 2018, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. I mean, how did that really come about? I mean, and also if you could talk about, limitations, shortcomings, or failings, that you saw in, this whole area of data, patients, and brain disease?
Yeah. So my kind of whole academic background, kind of going back 10 plus years, was in this kind of blend of neuroscience and engineering. And neuroscience, in particular, like human neuroscience, like what's going on in human brains, has always been an area where I've spent a lot of time and done a lot of work. I, before starting this company, spent 5 years at Verily. So when I joined, it wasn't even called Verily. It was this like group of 10 people inside Google X, and kind of later became Verily, right? And I took initially a little bit of a detour from neuroscience, and kind of worked on a series of hardware and software platforms in diabetes, and then a little bit of work in immuno-oncology, and got a view of like, oh, okay, here's like data informing and doing predictive things in medicine. And here's how it can work when it looks good. And I'd had enough experience in these neurological areas to know that was not how medicine works in neurology, right?
Right.
And then the second half of my career at Verily, I got back a little bit closer to my roots and had the opportunity to start this neuroscience joint venture with some folks at GlaxoSmithKline called Galvani. We were building a new, basically a new class of therapeutics that through stimulation of peripheral nerves in the gut could modulate immune disease. And they're often running human clinical trials now, so you can kind of follow along with them. But kind of going through that, I came back to seeing all of these old problems when you're looking at how do you develop and deliver neuroscience therapeutics versus like what's going on in oncology. So you have, you're in a situation where in development, animal models don't really recapitulate the human disease. So that's problematic. And then on the other side, so you need human data. You need human data to be able to do anything that is going to actually help you lower the risk of going into a clinical trial. And then, but human data hasn't historically been available. So it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg thing. And then I think I also got a view of like, because we were planning for how this was going to like go to market and scale up. It's like, oh, well, in order to deliver a complex therapy like this successfully, there has to be a data ecosystem around it. Otherwise, the immunologist, the neurologist, whoever, they don't have time to deal with all this. Like they need to be guided. In the same way that if you think about a very complex therapy like a CAR T therapy in oncology, like there's all of this data and support around it, right? So I was coming to appreciate that, and then I was, kind of thinking about what I was going to do next after we were kind of wrapping up this Galvani project, and was kind of how can I get back to my roots in the brain, and just kind of saw this opportunity to bring together data sources, specifically, starting in Parkinson's, that were becoming really prominent and being available at a reasonable scale. Like we weren't, these were going to be thousands of patients. So things like the explosion of brain imaging, DAT scans and structural imaging, things like the availability of high quality movement markers from the Apple Watch, for example. And then for example, our partnership with Medtronic, having these devices, which have previously been sort of, quote, like dumb devices, just kind of providing stuff, all of a sudden providing brain sensing because the electronic circuitry has evolved. Well, that's a massive new interesting data source. Again, that's at scale. So just kind of, saw the opportunity and figured the timing was right to try it. And we've been growing the company ever since. We started with a focus on supporting clinical trials. We launched a sort of real world care ecosystem in Parkinson's in August of last year. And we initially launched at UCSF. We expanded to a couple more universities in February. And now we're sort of in like rapid expansion mode across the US to health systems and clinics. And then, recently had this, we were able to kind of get the 510K clearance for the data we're bringing in from the watch. So that's been really nice to have as well in terms of accelerating adoption at hospitals and also enabling some additional things that we could do in the context of clinical trials.
Yeah, we're going to get to the FDA approval shortly, but just to give people context. So if I took Rune like out of the picture for a second, what was the standard practice of brain data tracking? I mean, what are the existing tools you might find in a neurologist lab for collecting, tracking EEG data or brain images of Parkinson's patients? Because I'm trying to get a sense of like how
Were we in
Yeah.
the dark ages, or
Well, I mean,
what are you trying to
I mean,
compete against?
yeah. So if you're unlucky enough to have somebody, with Parkinson's that you know that a typical Parkinson's visit involves basically no data at all, right? It's a very like tactile experience. You go in, the neurologist is sort of moving you around, assessing how rigid you are, how your gait is, how your tremor is, just in that 20-minute window. Is that 20-minute window representative of your actual experience outside the clinic? Maybe, probably not, but that's what they have to work with. They might, occasionally look at an image to make just a decision like, oh, okay, like we see this image, we see that your neuromodulation system was implanted correctly, and then they put that away and they never look at it again. Right? They certainly don't compare images across patients. So it's just that a lot of what we built on the software side, our company is like primarily software engineers. Like out of the 65 plus people, it's 30-ish software engineers. There's a lot of infrastructure that we built to just automatically go grab that data, structure it, in these sort of layers where you have brain data, you have clinical data, then you have like the Apple Watch patient data, and then just automatically surface those patterns. So somebody doesn't have to like go digging or like, make guesswork. It's like, okay, well, here's the pattern. So here's the pattern that tells you whether somebody's dosing is off, whether maybe you want to switch from the standard version to the controlled release version, whether they might be a good candidate for deep brain stimulation, whether that therapy is optimized, whether they should be matched to a certain clinical trial based on their phenotype. Like neurologists really haven't had the tools to do much except for one size fits all treatments. Like, okay, we know you have this diagnosis. It's been 3 years since your diagnosis. Therefore, this is what we're going to prescribe you, right? And so we're giving them a much richer set of tools, and again, really focusing on helping them see patterns which might otherwise be hard for them to see, that are now saying, hey, you can actually have a lot more context now to treat this patient with a Parkinson's diagnosis 2 years in differently than this patient with a Parkinson's diagnosis 2 years in, and get optimal outcomes that are different for each of them in a way that, I frankly isn't really possible today outside of maybe one or two like world-class top centers. Yeah.
It's funny. I was laughing and I thought maybe I should be crying, because like, if you think about how things are done, right? It's compared to the data analytics we have now, it sort of makes you like, we're in 2022. What the hell is going on? I mean, I feel like we should be much farther forward than we are.
Yeah, I mean, I think the missing ingredient was the availability of data, right? I mean, and I think that's, and I think it's fairly useful analogy to think that like kind of neurology is sort of where oncology was 15 years ago, and then on the back of the sort of genetics revolution, there's all this great stuff that was able to happen in oncology. Genetics hasn't been directly that useful in treating neurology diseases yet, but there's all this other data that's available now that's kind of exploding that we could take advantage of.
Yeah, I mean, look, I didn't write any of my books or have this podcast before all this data started to become available, because otherwise it was just on paper.
Yeah.
But let's talk a little bit about your product, Strive PD, right? This is a system that you're building that's designed to help people with Parkinson's disease understand and track sort of their symptoms. Like, it's an iOS app that's already out. I know you've already developed an Apple Watch app that we talked about briefly, and a wait list of patients who help you test it, right? So if you had to go through and describe it, sort of what kinds of data can patients enter into the app? How does an Apple Watch add to the kinds of data that you can collect? I mean, go through some of these, and if you miss any of them, I'll throw in another question.
So, the goal is to bring a super rich dashboard into the clinic that the neurologist and the patient can kind of look at together. And again, it can kind of inform which medication, which trial, et cetera, right? So to get there, we kind of work with patients, make sure they're using our kind of software in its intended way, especially 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after every clinical visit. So we can build that kind of continuous picture of how their disease is working in conjunction with their medications, with their environment, with exercise, with everything else, and bring that fully informed view. While doing that, though, we really try to ask as little of folks as possible. Like they already have, they have Parkinson's. Often they're trying to work, whether they're trying to see grands or trying to travel. Like we don't want to be a burden to them. So really what we ask them to do is do a few kind of daily interactions with the app to help us kind of, again, get that sort of qualitative picture of how things are going and a little bit more information about their medications. We try to provide some utilities like a medication tracker in there, and we can leverage Apple's medication tracker or sort of a built-in one. And then we just encourage them to just wear the Apple Watch. That's the great thing about they can use the Apple Watch as normal. They can receive messages, they can use it to track exercise, but in the background, we can bring in all of this rich Parkinson's movement data and some sleep data where relevant. And that is just so helpful, especially in context with this other stuff and helping clinicians understand if your dosing is correct, if the timing between doses is correct, if you're really like below or above a threshold of being well controlled where you might really benefit from a new therapy. The Apple Watch has been super impactful for that, and being able to predict whether or not like somebody is going to benefit from one of these things or how somebody might benefit. So, but yeah, I mean, from the from the perspective of the patient, we want to make it like reasonable. Like if you already have an Apple Watch and an iPhone, it's really all you're doing is downloading an app and spending a few minutes a day on it. And that's it. And then when you go into your next clinical visit, it should be a very different experience. Instead of having this like go in and say, oh, well, how are you doing for the last 6 months? Like, and then being poked and prodded to figure out like, it varies like, well, I can see that you're having troublesome tremor at 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. most mornings, and talk to me about like your medication schedule. Talk to me about this, like, is this consistent? And then you can kind of dial in and say, oh, actually, maybe you should be taking 2 pills in the morning instead of 4, but then we should dial up your evening dose to get that down. Or, those kind of conversations can happen really, really quickly, as opposed to maybe not happening at all in the context of a 20-25-minute clinical visit.
So why the Apple Watch? And I say that because like I just recently, spent, time talking to the head of data sciences at Whoop, right? Where it's 50 to 100 megabytes a day coming off this thing. Why this thing versus?
Yeah, I mean, Whoop is cool too. I think Apple Watch has like, there are 8 million people over the age of 55 in the US that have an Apple Watch. So you have this advantage of a massive install base of folks who are already using it. You have a ton of just kind of consumer acceptance and utility around the watch. We've obviously Apple's able to pour a ton of resources into development of Watch and HealthKit. I mean, we really look forward to WWDC, which is Apple's big developer conference every year, because we get to learn all of the new features that we just automatically get to upgrade into our platform, because Apple's been doing this work behind the scenes on sleep or gait metrics or whatever else. That's a huge benefit as well. So, but we are integrating kind of mostly in the context of clinical trials with other wearables as well. But in terms of like that mass consumer, like getting to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of folks, so far Apple Watch has felt like the right platform for us to be investing most of our time in.
So last month you got FDA clearance, so congratulations. That's huge. I always ask the people on this cutting edge getting these clearances, like what went into getting that?
A lot of work. I think there were kind of two elements of it. So one, I think the quality of the science, whenever you're going for one of these things, the quality of the science going in has to be good. And we're fortunate that, Apple, along with these kind of collaborators that are on this paper that they had published, had already done a fair amount of work validation. And so we were able to kind of have a good baseline that we could kind of continue to go from, and have a really high quality level of scientific validation of like, hey, this algorithm is really good at detecting tremor and dyskinesia remotely in patients. So that was like step one. And then, the other part of it was really kind of getting the FDA comfortable with, here's a quote unquote consumer device that now in this specific context, we're turning into a medical device, and providing all of the right kind of infrastructure, whether it's kind of testing, versioning control, like all of this stuff that's kind of happening between us and Apple, and to make sure that, as Apple's device continues to evolve and get better as a consumer device, we can maintain like super tight quality control on what clinicians see in terms of like, tremor and dyskinesia, for example. So there was a lot of kind of back and forth, making sure that we had that optimized, making sure we're able to prove that, test that, making sure that we're able to continue to ensure that over time. But yeah, I mean, it was, it was a process for sure. But it's when I've definitely been through worse processes. Like, I think it's one of these things where my sense is that regulators do overall recognize this is where things need to go in order to be able to enable high quality data at scale. And so they're overall, I got the sense of they were trying to figure out how to make this work. They weren't trying to figure out how to like slow it down or block it. Like, they were trying to figure out how to get
said that. I mean, you're one of the first people that's ever said that, there's worse things than working with the regulators at the FDA, because I usually get people that are freaking out about it. But let me ask you a question. So if I'm not mistaken, the Apple Watch actually taps into something that Apple created itself, which is their movement disorder API.
Yep.
Which was funny because until I started to do the digging in, I didn't realize that was there.
Yeah.
But how big of a deal was that for what you guys were tapping into for this?
Yeah, I mean, that was, I think I told the story in one of the interviews I did around it, but so this is early on, a couple of years ago. We were developing this out, and Apple allows you to get raw accelerometer and gyroscope data off the watch, and so we had kind of thought that's all we're going to be able to get. We're going to have to go develop our own metrics around this. And then I was digging around in the developer documentation online, and I saw movement disorder toolkit, tremor and dyskinesia. I was like, that's funny. And I just kind of on a whim, I was like, I'm gonna, because there was a little email, if you're curious about this toolkit, email here. And so I emailed there, and about 8 minutes later, the team lead there from Apple emailed me back. He's like, yeah, we should talk. I was like, wow, this is weird. Okay, let's go. Yeah, and so that was the beginning of us kind of figuring out about it. But I think it worked out really nicely because Apple, again, had done a lot of the legwork, and they basically have this API that people can pick up. But we were in a better position to actually take that across the finish line in the context of our ecosystem and get it to something that could be FDA approved. If that makes sense. So
yep,
it was a good division of labor. And hopefully now that we've kind of taken it across the finish line, other folks can benefit from this movement disorder API as well, and there can be a whole community of folks that start to leverage that. But yeah, right now we're sort of the first people to kind of take it across the sort of FDA finish line and be able to deliver it in the context that it can sort of improve somebody's care.
I'm sure that team over there is super excited.
Yeah, I think they've been happy with the outcome so far as I can tell. Yeah.
But so Apple's there in them, but you guys also, as you mentioned, I think you have a partnership with Medtronic, right? Which makes this deep brain stimulation called Percept, right?
Yep.
And if my understanding is correct, based on what you said and what I read, which Percept directly records brain signals in people with Parkinson's, and also then delivers the therapeutic stimulation, right? Can you explain what your partnership with Medtronic is about and what value, your organization hopes to bring to that whole dynamic?
Yeah. So I think the simplest way I can probably explain this is, the data that the brain sensing data that's coming out of this Percept device, if that's the only thing you had, it just, it kind of looks like a squiggly line, right? It's really hard to take that and take that and directly make, okay, I'm going to make this new clinical decision now, right? I'm gonna understand that. But if you can take that data and put it in context with this rich watch data, with all this other clinical data, then you can start to say, actually, when I see this type of brain signal, I know it means that this patient needs to be, these stimulation parameters changed in a certain way, or needs their medication optimized, or maybe needs a completely different program, right? And that's sort of that's sort of the hope and promise of having this sort of smart implant, right? Is that it can help guide therapy. And so I think why this partner with Medtronic works really well is we can bring this data together with all this context. We can sort of, hopefully make their therapy easier for clinicians to really achieve optimal outcomes for patients. And in process, give clinicians confidence that, like, hey, when I implant a DBS system, if it's a Medtronic DBS system and it has this brain sensing, I know I'm going to be able to optimize it for these patients. Like, I know they're going to have really good outcomes. And then
it's funny though, when you say that, I think of like at some point, if you have enough in there, like it's going to be able to make that decision on its own.
I hope so. Yeah, I mean, I think if you think about what we're building, really, it's a giant database of rich biomarkers, interventions, and outcomes, right?
Right.
And then so the more of that you have, the more you can say, okay, if I see these biomarkers, I know you should have these interventions to get these outcomes. And that's, it's like what Flatiron, for example, has been able to build up in oncology.
Right. Now, I know you guys have been deeply focused in Parkinson's, but
yeah,
I'm assuming you can apply what you learned in Parkinson's to a lot of other neurological issues. I'm going to guess, multiple sclerosis, autism spectrum disorder, OCD, maybe Alzheimer's. I think if I had to go out on a limb, I might say chronic pain, although I feel like that might be a little farther out, but
Yeah, I mean, as I kind of was alluding to this earlier, like, I think the key for us is the underlying science has to be there. Like, there has to be something predictive and useful we can do with the data that's available. And right now, for us, it feels like the next area that's going to be is MS, and we're running some kind of pilots in MS right now to see kind of how that pans out. If you had to kind of twist my arm right now, I would say that our second indication is probably going to be MS that we support, in addition to kind of maybe expanding out. I almost think about there's a group of patients, or not patients even. There's a group of people that have what's called prodromal Parkinson's, right? So they don't have Parkinson's diagnosis, but they're likely to go on to develop Parkinson's. I almost think about that as a different indication, but that's a really, really important one, because sort of the drugs of the future are not really going to be meant for folks that already have a PD diagnosis. They're going to be neuroprotective, right? So you're never going to get a PD diagnosis. That's the goal. But then you got to go find those folks with some high confidence. And that's a fun problem too that we're working on expanding into. And that actually, something like the Apple Watch, which again already has like a big install base, is going to be kind of an important platform to be able to kind of go and find those folks.
So it's funny because I'm giving a lot of talks because of the new book and so forth, and I'm like, I can't imagine that people aren't, going to have these things as early warning systems. So part of me says, I mean, do you think there's a role for data analytics and wearable devices in early detection of, I know it's Parkinson's disease, but neurological issues that, I mean, I already have the Apple Watch on. It's just this app that's sitting on there that's sort of monitoring.
I mean, I think the important ingredient there is, let's say there's an early detection, right? What do you do about it? What do you, the person who just got detected, now that you have early, you're having on development, what do you do about it? And I think why Parkinson's is exciting in that area right now is there are upcoming in the next 6 to 18 months, neuroprotective trials that you can go enroll in if you're likely to go on to develop PD that may slow your progression, may prevent you from ever progressing, right? That's something like very tangible that you can do with that knowledge, right? There's also some like softer things like exercise more, like his exercise is mentioned a little bit, which would be good to know, right? But like, just generally good advice, I think. And so yeah, I mean, I think so. That's kind of key for me as I think about that, is how can you pair, like in cardiac, right? If you get early detection of cardiac stuff, there's something you can do about it, right? You can go
Yes.
save your life essentially. And so I'm looking for opportunities in neurology, whether it's Parkinson's or MS, where if you get that early detection, there's an intervention that you can go pursue that is going to, hopefully meaningfully change your long-term outcome.
Yeah, I also think like a lot of people want to know so that they can plan their lives accordingly.
Yeah, maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
I hear most doctors say, well, I mean, there's nothing I can do about it. I'm like, well, but I want to plan my own life.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's the sort of it's the pejorative kind of thing, but like the movement disorders neurologists kind of this thing, diagnose and adios. It's like the sort of kind of cliche thing people say about neurologists, which is like, yeah, you have this, there's not a lot we can do about it, goodbye. And so, but is that okay, fine, but I'm excited about it, say, well, okay, we can see this happening, here's what to do about it, and we know that there's a high likelihood of success because we have the data to back that up.
So I was, again, I was, rooting around and doing my research, but like more than most startups, I mean, you guys seem to have sort of laid out a whole set of ethical values, right? I mean, first, talk about the way you view patients. Your company says it wants to be a human-centric company where you never forget that brains have owners and that people with brain disease deserve empathy. And how does that translate into design decisions, product development choices? What does it mean to build a human-centric database, for example, or how do you view privacy? Those sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, as you're kind of alluding to, it sort of bleeds into everything, right? Like from the very first, from the way that we structure the consent agreement, it's very plain worded language. We're asking for the sort of minimum necessary that we need, giving patients a lot of flexibility, to how we think about, again, kind of how do we sort of ask as little of folks as possible, because we know like we're not their main concern, right? Like, so how do we be respectful of that? To how do we involve folks with Parkinson's in the company, in the product development? And that's something that is not the most straightforward thing to do for a variety of reasons, right? Like, people with Parkinson's, they have a challenging neurodegenerative disease. They're not just going to be like a quote normal employee at the company. Usually, they're on medication that is wildly changing the dopamine contents of their brain, right? So that's right. There are all kinds of things, but you have to. I don't know. We don't have it perfect yet, but we're always trying to get better at it. Like, how do you set up systems to work with those people, to bring them in, to make sure that a wide range of those voices is heard, and let that influence the design, let that influence the strategy. We incorporated a patient advisory board formally in like March, I think. We had been doing it informally for a while, but so having this formal patient advisory board is great because we can meet with them on like a regular quarterly basis, for example, around our kind of key result planning, and do a real sanity check to make sure it's like, hey, these are the key results the company is going after. How would you stack rank these as being meaningful to patients, and make sure that like that is lining up, and that we're biasing towards tackling things that are going to be really meaningful to the folks that we're ultimately trying to like benefit here, and not doing things that are kind of like only indirectly benefiting folks way downstream or something like that. So, but yeah, I think it's I don't know. It's also ultimately what makes just going to work every day more rewarding, is because you're interacting with the people that, again, are like, they're using your software, you're helping them, you're seeing them benefit, right? And they're telling you when it's not working like expected too, and you're getting that feedback. But I have all these friends now that have Parkinson's, and I am super motivated to help them out, and to try and get the best possible outcomes for them.
Now, it seems like the first thing I said is going to bleed into this next thing. You also have an unusual approach to management and team building, right? So all documents are shared with all employees at all or most meetings are open to all employees, and you give employees a lot of individual responsibility. I mean, it sounds like a fairly flat organization if I had to frame it that way. I mean, how do you summarize your management philosophy? I mean,
yeah, transparency and autonomy. I think we try to optimize for it. You know, I think one of the things that I think we've had to grow, you know, it's just kind of a growth thing, is like, as we go from 10 to 20 to now 65 plus folks, you want to make sure that folks benefit from the transparency and autonomy, but don't also feel the pressure to like know everything that's going on, right? So you have to kind of make sure that everybody, we spend a lot of time on internal comms, right? And just making sure, you know, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it. You know, here are the patients we're helping, here are the clinicians we're helping. And then just repeating. And then every quarter, as the goals, as you know, as we try to get more and more ambitious, making sure that gets communicated, being very transparent about it. After every board meeting, I do and ask me like an AMA, ask me anything with the company, share the board deck. They can ask about, you know, where the company is going and everything from like strategy to finances to kind of like in the weeds board discussions. Happy to share that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think it, you know, it's one of those things where, I mean, you have to, you know, be careful about hiring and stuff, but ultimately you want to trust the people, right, that are on your team, and then have them trust you reciprocally. And that's if you can do that, it's a superpower, right? If you can't do that, you need to have all this like rules and bureaucracy and stuff, and that makes things very slow. But if you can do that, you can be very, very responsive to feedback from customers, and feedback from patients and clinicians. And you know, that's the beauty of running a startup, right? Is you can respond very quickly and move very quickly. But I think the foundation of that is trust. For me, the foundation of trust is transparency and autonomy.
So now you say something right on the front of your website or on the website that says potentially discovering new biomarkers for disease progression. And I think the term is digital biomarker, which of course I love that term. Are there any examples that you can share that you guys might have, like, you know, not giving away like the trade secrets or anything, but that you guys have sort of identified as unique?
Yeah, we're with a few publications coming in September that I don't really want to scoop, but we're publishing at both. We're publishing at Movement Disorder Society and also the World Society for Functional Neurosurgery. So those are two big conferences that are important to the Parkinson's kind of clinical community. But I'll say generally it's, we've been able to do more as two things have become more true. So one is obviously keeping patients on the platform for longer, so having to come back visit after visit after visit, so you can actually see some trajectory, right? Like that's super important. And you know, as we've started to have patients on the platform now for a couple of years, we're able to say more interesting things there, right? The other thing that's important that we've been able to do more is make sure that we're, as much as possible, we're bringing that data that reads directly on what's happening in the brain and can be related to underlying mechanism, right? So it's one thing to have like a lot of continuous symptom data. You can show that symptom data evolves over time. It's a completely different thing to have that plus say, hey, and by the way, this is how the underlying brain network is shifting over time. Or this is how this blood-based biomarker of mitochondrial dysfunction in the brain is evolving over time. And it's really making that link that allows you to say something that's not, you know, oh, here's how the symptoms are progressing, and we think this is indicative of disease progression. It's actually saying, hey, like we think this is actually a disease progression signal here. We can see it being clinically meaningful, but also we can say that actually the brain structure or the brain chemistry is also changing over time in a way that correlates, that makes sense. So, you know, it's early days, obviously. Like, you know, I think these publications are a good first step, but it's, you know, it's where we got to go. So we got to get more patients, keep them on for longer, and then get more of this underlying, what is really going on in the brain data linked with the kind of continuous symptom data that allows you to quantify what's going on with folks. You know.
Yeah, and I can see the value of this, you know, growing in orders of magnitude as you understand other diseases and the changes that are, because I'm sure there's going to be massive overlap in some diseases.
Yeah. I mean, there's co-pathologies, there's, underlying networks that are highly correlated in AD and PD. Yeah.
So I want to circle back and ask you a different frame for understanding what you're trying to do. I read an opinion piece in that you wrote in Med City News where you argue about precision neurology. I mean, and I've been talking about precision medicine, I feel like forever. What do you mean by that? I mean, how close is the analogy from other forms of precision medicine like oncology? And if you want to do precision neurology right, what kinds of data do we need?
Yeah. So I think for me, where something transitions over to something you can reasonably call precision medicine is when you can use data to make a prediction that is going to be clinically meaningful. Whether that prediction is, how a therapy should be configured or prescribed or dosed, or again, like trial matching or whatever it is, like it's data being predictive in the context of an indication. And so when I think about what that looks like in Parkinson's, I can tell you that the two data sources that have been the most predictive by far, up until now at least, have been the continuous Apple Watch symptom data and the electrophysiology, the invasive brain sensing that's coming out of the implants. I am extremely hopeful, and I think we have good reason to believe that we'll find other data sources that are going to be predictive as we scale up and collect more of it. But right now, those two are the areas where we're able to take that data today and put it in context, the right context for clinicians, and say, hey, like this is indicative of a pattern which predicts that this patient needs their stimulation reduced or needs their medications changed or should actually be enrolled in this clinical trial, that type of thing. So but yeah, there's going to be more. I think the one of the issues with doing this in a disease like Parkinson's, super heterogeneous, super time varying, you need scale, right? That's why we're focused on scaling to 50 plus hospitals by the end of the year, representing a population of 10,000 plus patients. Like you need that big bulk of folks so that you can really see the signal and the noise and pull out the individual patterns.
Well, okay, so assuming that happens, if I just follow every other disease I've been watching over time, the more precise we get is, do you think based on what you've seen so far that you're going to see multiple etiologies that need to be managed, right? Because it's like saying breast cancer back in the day.
I wouldn't be the first person to say that either. I mean, and that's like whenever you go to any PD conference, right? Whether it's a scientific conference or a clinical conference, that's sort of like the whispers around the lunch table, right? It's like, hey, like we're not really dealing with one disease here. Like we're dealing with these different co-pathologies. You're dealing with PD1, PD2, PD3. And everybody's trying to think about, okay, how do we actually evolve to recognize that and treat these separately? And that's, hopefully we're a meaningful part of that journey with Rune Labs and making that a reality. Because exactly as with oncology, it's a step function change in your ability to treat those folks, to develop new therapies for those folks, and really to understand the neuroscience of the disease, right? Unlock, the potential to reach new targets.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, I still think like at some point it'd be great to have an early warning system.
Well, I'll make sure that when we set up this initial pipeline trial, I'll make sure that you get an invite to enroll. You can kind of you can see. Yeah,
that sounds great. Well, it was great talking to you. I can only wish you incredible success because I mean the changes or the advances you guys are making are going to be meaningful to a patient population that really needs that help.
Well, thanks, Harry. I mean, we hope so. Yeah, we're pushing on it.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Harry.